his problems are going to get worse and worse and worse. And he's going to have to do something to raise more manpower. Currently, it looks like he's going to sort of, quote unquote, buy or pay for North Koreans to come over and fight his fight. The leader in the north of Korea is he likes to be able to buy or sell and make money. And so we'll see how that works out.
Russian presidential aide Nikolai Patrushev gave an interview to the Russian media only yesterday in which he said the Kremlin remains committed to achieving the original goals of its full-scale invasion, specifically dissolution of the current government of Ukraine, demilitarization of Ukraine, and a permanent ban on Ukraine ever joining NATO. Now, it seems to me that is a non-starter if you're Volodymyr Zelensky. Do you think that is just a negotiating tactic, or do you think Putin actually genuinely would be prepared to compromise on one of or all of those?
Well, I think Mr. Putin must have read Mr. Trump's book. If you read or have paid attention to The Art of the Deal, in chapter 6, Mr. Trump talks all the time about set an incredibly high bar at the beginning of any negotiation so that you can negotiate back from it and be seen as a good and faithful negotiator. And that's a paraphrase that probably wouldn't wash for scholars, but for the casual reader, that's essentially what Mr. Trump says. Clearly, Mr. Putin is setting the bar at an impossible place now. He is setting the bar saying the only thing I will accept is complete capitulation, meeting all of my demands, and then we'll talk. And so that should not wash with the West. I would also say that one of the arguments I've heard out there is that, well, maybe we should give Mr. Putin everything in order to get a cessation in hostilities. What most military commentators will tell you is Russia needs a cessation in hostilities worse than anybody. Their army is beaten up. Think about this. A portion of Russia has been taken over by Ukraine, and Russia can't dislodge them. They have to ask North Korea to come help them to clear Ukrainians out of sovereign Russian lands. That's how bad it is for Mr. Putin right now.
Well, that's a really good point. And I wanted to put to you, General, the argument that some people make that actually now is not the time to hold peace talks, because let's say towards the end of 2025, the conditions for peace talks would be maybe much more favourable to Ukraine. Now, clearly, everyone wants this war to end as quickly as possible. You know, far too many lives have been lost on all sides. But given the state of the Russian economy, given the Russian casualty rate, given, as you say, Ukraine occupy parts of Kursk Oblast and are making new offensive operations in the last week or so, maybe now is not the time to be having any peace negotiations, and Ukraine would be better served by having them towards the end of the year.
Well, I understand all that reasoning. I get it. And there is some good thinking there, but also Ukraine is hurting for manpower. Maybe not as badly as Russia right now, but Ukraine is hurting for manpower. They're standing alone. Russia has multiple nations, Chechens, North Koreans, all of these people fighting for them, and they're still hurting for manpower. And so both sides are in a tough spot. So I don't want to disagree with what you suggested, but I'm just saying that there's two sides to this coin, and the same dynamic is hurting Ukraine. And in fact, some of the international community are screaming for Ukraine to change who and at what age they bring people into their military in order to increase the size of the drawing base for their military. And for reasons we all understand, Mr. Zelensky is opposed to that. So, this coin has got both two sides to it, and they both are facing some of those problems. But I would tell you that we should not look at a cessation of hostilities as winning something from the Russians. The Russians desperately need for this war to stop. Their military has been beaten up. They're worn out. They're thin at the leadership positions. They are still losing at a rate that is unthinkable to us in the West. on this front line. And now the North Koreans are joining us in those horrendous, joining Russia in those horrendous losses. So there are dynamics here that have to be recognized. And I'm going to say it now for the third time, because I hope somebody actually understands what I'm saying. Capitulation to Russia to get a cessation in hostilities would be a enormous mistake. Russia has to have concessions in any peace talks in the future.
And in your view, General, what concessions that are realistic would you like to see from Russia?
Well, Russia doesn't get to dictate the NATO aspirations of Ukraine. Ukraine is a sovereign nation. Ukraine will make its own decisions about aspirations for NATO. This has been a pattern with Russia. They scream about NATO encroaching on Russia. May I just tell you, having sat in 3 years of the meetings about increasing the number from 28, NATO is not out there clawing to bring nations into NATO. In fact, most of the time nations get a big hand, and years, if not decades, go by before they can get in. The Baltic nations fought hard to get into NATO, and many opposed it for a long time. And the latest accessions, with the exception of Finland and Sweden, which were nearly immediate, the latest accessions of former Russian controlled nations, they were all screaming to get into NATO. And so this is a dynamic that the future will hold. But the point I want to make is there are lots of things that I do not believe the West should consider. And one of them is allowing Russia to control the sovereign decisions of Ukraine.
So do you think, therefore, that something like a guarantee that Ukraine can either join NATO in the next few years or is on a path to membership of NATO, something around that is going to be a prerequisite of any agreement?
May I just sort of rephrase what you said? Acknowledging a promise we've already made to Ukraine. Hasn't the West already told Ukraine it will become a member of NATO?
It has. It has. And I suppose you need to see some more concrete detail as to what is the time frame for that happening. But you can understand from a Ukrainian perspective why they would be very rightly skeptical of that, because we've been here before. Everyone remembers the Budapest Memorandum, and we've seen security guarantees that have been made to Ukraine that the West has failed to meet. So Ukraine will need some detail on this.
You just stole my next talking point. I mean, we have exactly been here before, and I'm not being accusatory here. The US and UK do have a special relationship. The US and UK both have fallen down in their promises in the Budapest Memorandum. I would say my nation more than the UK, but the fact of the matter is there were 4 signatories. The US and the UK were 2 of them. And we have, let's be generous, we have underperformed in our assurances made in the Budapest Memorandum.
Something I have thought a lot about in recent weeks is whether part of Donald Trump's skepticism about military aid for Ukraine is linked to his general view that for too long Europe has been freeloading off American largesse when it comes to defense spending. And he is right to say that many NATO members have not been meeting their defense spending commitments. He gave a speech last week in which he said it should be 5% of GDP. I think that's unrealistic for most countries, but he's certainly right they need to increase the amount they're spending on defense because Europe is most at risk from Russian expansionism. So if NATO members in Europe were prepared to make bolder commitments around their own defense spending, do you think that might change the way Trump views American support for Ukraine?
I think the easy answer is yes, and I think it is the answer. I think that President Trump now actually is happy about the fact that he stirred the pot so hard in his first administration that NATO has come around. In a large degree, we have made huge progress And that progress has accelerated as it became clear that President Trump could be the president again towards meeting the current set of goals. And so I think that, Chapter 6, set the bar high, negotiate from the bar. I think that Mr. Trump wants to see NATO do more. It would be good if everybody used the same set of words. This is not about countries paying NATO. They don't pay NATO. It's Article 3 investing in their own military is what we're talking about. And so, yes, I think that that a further renaissance about the need and the reasoning for European investment is very clear. And the good news is Mr. Putin is helping that every day with this illegal, immoral, insane war that he cranked up on his own volition. I think that is helping NATO to see what's going on.
How delicate a position do you think Vladimir Putin is in ahead of any potential peace talks? Because on the one hand, if he doesn't make enough concessions, we've heard from, for example, General Kellogg that the US may be prepared to ramp up military aid for Ukraine. And as you've described, General, Russia with its casualty rate and its supply issues can't necessarily afford for this war to drag on much longer. So there's a risk there. But equally, if he is seen to give in to too many demands from Ukraine and the West, is there not a political risk for him at home? He will be seen to have failed on his objectives, which he's been very clear about. So how delicate a position do you think he's in?
Well, the answer to about 3 of those questions is yes. And the final answer is he is in a delicate position because he has to come out of this showing something for the investments that he's made. And remember that the Russian people still don't know the casualty rates of Ukraine. Mothers are still being told their sons are coming home, and they are not. And so if you remember the moms in Moscow sort of approach during the last first part of this 10-year plus long war, if you remember that, he faced a lot of tough time, and he's tried to engineer this war to first take men from the far eastern parts of Russia, east of the Urals, and then in the rural, not urban areas of the western part of Russia. He's desperately trying to avoid those centers where, when they start realizing the horrific losses of this war, his problem will get harder. He needs a victory before that begins to hit, because people are not going to accept what has actually happened and what Russia is covering up inside its own narrative inside its country.
Do you think if this is still a hot war in 6 months' time, it is inevitable that Putin will have to look again at mobilization?
A famous American philosopher called Yogi Berra said the problem about predictions are you have to know the future. I'm not going to go there. I think that let's just leave it at this. His problems are going to get worse and worse and worse. And he's going to have to do something to raise more manpower. Currently, it looks like he's going to sort of, quote unquote, buy or pay for North Koreans to come over and fight his fight. The leader in the north of Korea is he likes to be able to buy or sell and make money. And so we'll see how that works out.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.